You've been told that the theme is the truth that you want to scream from the rooftops, but that you shouldn't make it too obvious or too preachy either. So you do the work. You find that one truth you think your story is trying to say, you turn it into your protagonist's misbelief, map their fears versus their desires, build scenes that challenge everything they believe. And yet, halfway through the first draft, you realize you have no idea what your theme actually is. That's because you're waiting for your theme to emerge. Best-selling authors don't. They build 3 specific elements into every character, from your protagonist down to that one character who appears once for 2 lines and then never comes back. And once you understand what these 3 elements are, the themes will no longer be something you chase, it becomes something you control, something that you can design to make your story truly unforgettable. This is part 1 of a 2-part series on how to build a theme of your story and layer it into the structure of your novel. In this video, you will learn what the 3 elements are and how to design them for every character. Then in part 2, you will discover the specific mechanics to bring them to life on the page without hitting your readers over the head with the message that your novel carries. So make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss the next part. Alright, those 3 elements, you need to tackle them in a specific order, from the broadest one to the highly specific one. I will walk you through all 3, and if it feels like a lot at first, don't worry, everything will click once you see how it all plays out in Harry Potter. The first component, the one that is the broadest, is called the moral need. Now, something that I get asked very often is whether or not the moral need is supposed to be a positive or a negative thing. It is neither. It is the universal truth that you want to express through your story that every character will struggle with. And when you phrase a moral need, you're doing 2 things at once. You're stating that universal truth, and you're pointing to what happens when characters don't understand it or don't live by it. Here's how you build it. First, define the broader subject that your story is about. It could be love, it could be forgiveness, grief, connection, whatever. Then you want to take that broad term and dive into what this concept looks like in your story. If your story is about forgiveness, then what exactly needs to be forgiven? If the moral need of your story is about love, then what does love look like for your specific story? What kind of love even is being withheld? What kind of love is being forced? Or, I don't know, misunderstood. And once you've defined that, the next step is to attach consequences to it. Let me give you a quick example. Say your moral need is about love. More specifically, it's about the fact that sometimes walking away from a relationship, even when the other person is a good person, is the most loving thing you can do for yourself, but also for them. So what happens when your characters don't understand this truth yet? Maybe they're stuck in a relationship that's slowly suffocating them. They stay because of the kids, because of what people will think, or maybe because they feel obligated to stay. The other person isn't an antagonist per se, they're actually a great person, but they're just not the right person. And because your characters don't understand that sometimes leaving is the graceful thing to do, they're keeping themselves miserable and they're keeping the other person miserable too. That's the status quo. That's the world your characters are living in when the story begins, a world shaped by not understanding the moral need yet. Your characters live their lives at the beginning of the story in dissonance with that core truth. They can't see it, they don't understand why it matters, and because of that, they're stuck, believing the world is against them, that there's nothing in their control, nothing in their power that they can do to break free. But there's a reason they're stuck in that loop, and it needs to be logical. That's where the next component comes in, the psychological need. This is the heart of your story. It is the psychological barrier, the unresolved emotion that's preventing your characters from understanding and learning the moral need of your story. Think of it this way. If the moral need is the truth that they can't see, then the psychological need is the emotional blindfold preventing them from seeing it. It's what stands in the way and what your characters will eventually need to face and overcome by the end. It is the inner villain, so to speak. Now, psychological needs aren't designed randomly. We use something called the emotion triad. And I have to thank a viewer of the channel, Georgina, for bringing this concept to my attention because it clarified the entire framework. The emotion triad identifies the 3 core emotional barriers to growth and change. So you have guilt, you have shame, and then you have anger. Now, you might be wondering why these 3 specifically? Well, in psychology, shame, anger, and guilt are the 3 emotions that create the deepest psychological barriers to growth and change. They're what keep people stuck in destructive patterns, unable to move forward even when they really want to. Think of the emotion triad as your menu of options. And here's how to choose which one your story needs. Take your protagonist, or any character for that matter, and look at what their status quo punishes them for. If the psychological need is around guilt, then your characters believe, I did something wrong. They fear being seen as a bad person, losing respect, or having to make a painful choice they're not ready for. If the psychological need is about shame, then your characters believe, I am something wrong. They fear being exposed as weak or having it confirmed that they're fundamentally unworthy. If the psychological need is around anger, then your characters believe the world did something wrong to me. They fear that if they let go of that anger, they'll have nothing left to hold on to. That forgiveness means letting someone off the hook. So once you've identified your moral needs, so what your story is about, you pick which of these three emotions your characters need to confront in order to break free from the loop they're stuck in. Now, just like the moral need, the psychological need is common to all of your characters. And this is designed on purpose so that you have a unified theme throughout your story where every character represents a facet or a different angle of the theme. So if you're struggling to figure out which emotion from the triad actually fits your protagonist best or fits your story best, then explore how the psychological need expresses for your key characters, and you should get clarity on which emotion is getting in the way. Now you might be thinking, wait a second, Jules, if I design a moral need and a psychological need that's common to all of my characters, aren't they all gonna sound and feel the same? I actually got asked this recently in my coaching program. The question was, how can a single thing be relevant to all main characters? Wouldn't every character, including the villain, have different goals and inner struggles? And that's where the third and final component comes in, the psychological wound. This is the element of the theme that is specific to each character, and it has two sides to it. Think of it like a coin. Wait a second, wait for me. My ears is like, what's happening? Okay, vamos chicas. So, think of it like a coin. On one side you have the specific backstory event, and on the other side you have the unique fears that event created. The backstory event is the root of the wound, and the fear is what grows from it. In other words, the backstory event happened in the past, and the fears are what the character believes will happen in the future if they confront it. Together, they form the psychological wounds of your characters. This duality, the wound and the fears that it creates, is what makes the broader psychological need of the story truly theirs and therefore so hard to confront, which then reinforces the logic of why they're stuck in their loop, not understanding the moral need and suffering the consequences. Let me show you how this all plays out in a story you already know. Before we go any further, there's no need to get worked up around Harry Potter. I'm using it for the sake of familiarity and to help you digest complex storytelling concepts. It has nothing to do with my personal views, but feel free to express your frustration in the comments if you feel compelled to do so. It's all good. Safe space, bro. In Harry Potter, the moral need is around belonging and worthiness. More specifically, it's that true belonging comes not from bloodline or destiny, but from the values that you choose and the actions that you take. And as long as this truth is not fully understood, belonging and worthiness risk becoming hollow, defined by blood purity, by reputation, or by empty symbols of achievement rather than real connection. You can see how the moral need is slightly colored by the world building of Harry Potter by infusing concepts like bloodline and destiny, so you should definitely explore how certain aspects of your world building can color the moral need of your story. Now, the psychological need in Harry Potter is that every character needs to confront their deepest shame. Shame about their origins, about their blood status, shame about their place in the world. We're still speaking in broad terms, shame about where you come from, shame about who you are. And in Harry Potter, that psychological need is what drives the characters to seek worth in external markers like power, status, and reputation. It's what prevents them from recognizing that true belonging is chosen through love and loyalty. Now, let me show you how the psychological wound makes each character unique, even when they share the exact same moral and psychological needs. For Voldemort, this psychological need, the need to confront shame, is shaped by two key backstory events. First, you have the fact that he was conceived under a love potion. He was literally born with a love, and it marked him with an incapacity to experience or value love. This wound creates a specific fear, the fear of vulnerability, the fear of love itself, and the fear of being seen as unworthy of it. Then you have his upbringing in Wool's orphanage. He was abandoned at birth, raised without connection or nurture. Tom Riddle grew up in an environment that confirmed his worst fear, that he was unwanted. His intelligence and magical gifts set him apart, but instead of softening the psychological wound, they deepened it. And so, as he grew older, he learned to manipulate and intimidate in order to force loyalty. Because of these wounds and the fears that they created, Voldemort couldn't confront his shame. Rather than face it, he buried it under bloodline pride, obsession with heritage, and the pursuit of immortality and power. And until he confronts that shame, he will never see the truth of the story, the moral need, which is that real belonging is chosen through values and human connection. And refusing to face that shame is what destroys him in the end. For Hermione, the psychological wound is her background as a Muggle-born. Entering the wizarding world, she feels her place is fragile, as though her bloodline makes her less legitimate than others. This wound creates fears that are specific to her. The fear of not being perfect, the fear of being exposed as less than, but more importantly, the fear that one mistake will prove she doesn't belong. Instead of confronting her shame directly, she overcompensates through knowledge and scholar achievement. Her brilliance becomes a shield, a way to prove that she deserves her place at Hogwarts. And because she hasn't confronted that shame yet, her sense of belonging is conditional, dependent on how useful or competent she is rather than on who she is. Which means one perceived failure could shatter everything she's built. For Ron, the psychological wound is growing up in a large, poor family where he constantly feels overshadowed. With older brothers who outshine him in different ways and a lack of wealth to match families like the Malfoys, he worries that he will always be second best. This wound creates specific fears, the fear of never measuring up, of being second best forever, and the fear that he will never be good enough on his own. And because he hasn't confronted the shame, his sense of belonging feels precarious and is easily shaken whenever someone else seems more talented or more admired. For Draco, the psychological wound is being raised in a wealthy, pure-blood family that ties identity to bloodline and status. From childhood, he's taught that his worth depends on heritage and superiority, not on who he is and the values he lives by. This psychological wound creates fears that are specific to him. The fear of one day losing status and the fear that without his family name, he's nothing. Instead of confronting his shame, Draco clings to arrogance and prejudice. By elevating himself above others, he masks the insecurity that his belonging is conditional, propped up by family name and ideology rather than who he actually is. And because he hasn't faced it, his belonging remains brittle. The moment his status is challenged, his sense of self begins to collapse. Poor Draco. This even works for characters who only appear briefly or from time to time. Let me show you with Dobby. Dobby's psychological wound is years of abuse as a house elf serving the Malfoy family. That wound creates a specific fear, the fear of freedom itself, because what if he's not worthy outside of servitude? What if punishment is all he deserves? And because he hasn't confronted his shame about being a house elf, about his place in the world, he can't see or understand the moral need that belonging comes from the values you choose, not the role you were born into. That's why he punishes himself. Bad Dobby, it's shame unconfronted. So yes, even a character who appears briefly, if they matter to your story, they benefit from this framework. You'll notice that I didn't break down Harry himself, and that's intentional. If you look at Voldemort and Harry side by side, their psychological need and psychological wounds are remarkably similar. They're two sides of the same coin, just like earlier, both abandoned, both questioning their worthiness and seeking belonging. Each shows how the same wounds and fears can lead to radically different choices. So here's what makes this framework so powerful. The psychological wound creates specific fears. Those fears prevent characters from confronting the psychological need, and as long as the psychological need remains unfulfilled, they can't see or understand the moral need. That's how you build a theme from the ground up. Now that you know how to build and design the theme of your story, you need to understand the mechanics to show these thematic elements on the page without being too on the nose and without being too preachy. And that's what we cover in part 2, which you can watch by clicking right here. And if it's not available yet, I'll put the video on my internal conflict framework. If you've enjoyed this video, you will definitely love that one. And if part 2 is already ready, then the video about internal conflict will be linked below.